This podcast is dedicated to Queen Elizabeth II. So hello everyone and welcome back to the 5 Red Lights F1 podcast. My name is Aaron Harper. Today we're going to be going through the Italian Grand Prix-Cap. And as I said before, this podcast is dedicated to Queen Elizabeth II. We're going to be discussing Ferrari. We're going to be discussing the safety car finish. We're going to talk about why Williams have to replace Latifi with Nick DeVries for 2023. We're going to driver rate. We're going to race rate. And hopefully it will be a lovely show. Max Verstappen wins the Italian Grand Prix, his 5th win in a row, but really Ferrari should have won this for me. We have to first of all congratulate Red Bull on another victory, Max's 11th win of the season, 11 out of 16 races. You know, it's absolutely incredible run of form, and Red Bull, let's not do them a disservice. They are operating at A+ level. They are operating fantastically. They've got a driver in Max who has now found his tune, his groove with this car, and is just exploiting it. They've given it that extra bit of rotation at the front end that really suits Max. And as soon as they did that, it's gone away from Checo, and he hasn't been seen since. He's not had a sniff of a victory since then. So that would have been sort of around Silverstone, Azerbaijan time. But for me, the big problem at the moment, well, I'll say the problem, but the big reason, I think, behind Verstappen and Red Bull's run of victories is Ferrari. And the fact that they've got the faster car, on a Saturday at least, but they haven't got the racecraft on a Sunday. They haven't got a car that, well, they do have a car that can race, but they don't have the team to do it, and that's been evident all season. So let's face facts. Ferrari have had a car that could win every race so far this season. They've had the car performance and the driver in Charles Leclerc to win this championship, and yet they find themselves miles behind Red Bull. Charles is 116 points adrift of Max Verstappen. You cannot tell me that there is 116 points difference in their tally, in their talent. And yet, Verstappen has 11 wins to Leclerc's 3. Sainz and Perez have 1 each. It's just utter domination. But it's not because there's a massive car advantage or a driver advantage. There is the fact that the Red Bull is a very good car and that Max Verstappen is a very, very good racing driver. But it's not like back in the Schumacher era and at some points of the Mercedes domination era where you just knew that they were going to execute perfectly at every single point of the weekend. Red Bull haven't got everything perfect. They haven't got the car on a regular basis to take pole position in the same way that maybe Schumacher and Ferrari would, or certainly Mercedes and Hamilton could. So Charles Leclerc puts it on pole on Saturday, and you'd think starting from pole position, home soil for the Tifosi and the Scuderia, perhaps this would be different. But no, they produced the dumbest strategy possible to try and win the race. Had Ferrari run a conventional one-stop strategy, they would have won the race, I think. Yeah, Max Verstappen had a good chance. He had the pace, he has that slippiness, that less drag, sort of configuration, that's the word I'm looking for, with the Red Bull. But it was the other way around this weekend, because the Red Bull was quicker in the corners because they ran a really big rear wing, whereas the Ferrari was much quicker down the straights. And, you know, you can go one of two ways, and sometimes, you know, the downforce option really helps you because you get good traction, you can accelerate out of the corner, you can carry momentum onto the straight, but it can harm your top end speed. But Red Bull could get away with that because their car is just so drag free, and the Ferrari had to go for the straight line speed because they generally have good cornering speed. So it was a really interesting duel that was set up. Now, was pitting under virtual safety car the big error for Ferrari? Arguably yes, arguably no. It's certainly a cheaper stop than it is under green flag conditions, but it did give Verstappen track position. And it left Leclerc needing to make up a lot of ground. He had to essentially close up to Verstappen, and he didn't. Now, normally making up ground with the DRS and making those overtakes, it dramatically boosts lap time. But around Monza, because he runs such a skinny wing, generally, the delta, so that's the difference between using DRS and not, is much smaller because you don't get so much of a benefit. And the slipstream effect is less with the 2022 cars. Was Ferrari's mistake putting on mediums versus the hards? Well, possibly. And I think this is perhaps the crux of their Monza downfall, because Ferrari got their hands burnt in Budapest when they put the hard tyres on Charles Leclerc and just went nowhere. Maybe they just didn't want to use them again. We don't know. But the end of the race comes and they could have had a shootout, which we're going to discuss in a moment. But Ferrari should never have been second place in that race, for me at least. They had the advantage of pole position. They had the car with the characteristics to win the race. They didn't have the strategy to do it. They were on the radio to him before the VSC, talking about plan A and B and C, and there's so many different scenarios going on there. I'm not sure if they actually know which one they're going with. They don't have a plan and stick to it. And you can say you can come undone just by sticking to a plan, but actually if you have a firm idea of what you're going to do, then that'll give you the security to go out and deliver it. If you keep umming and ahhing and flitting between what you will and won't do in certain situations, all gets a bit confused. And I think that's what's going on at Ferrari. And look, as I said at the start of this segment, Ferrari could have won every race. They've had the car at every single race to win it. And yet they've only won 5 races. 4 races even. They find themselves with just a third of the victories that Red Bull have. And I think that, looking back now, with 6 races still to go, is almost the most damning look at Ferrari's season. And of course, this race could have looked completely different had we had this sort of mini sprint finish. Think back to Azerbaijan last year, where we had a late red flag because of concerns over tyres after Verstappen's tyre blowout a few laps from the end. And we had a 2-lap sprint, and that of course culminated in Sergio Perez winning the race after Lewis Hamilton made an error at the restart. Should F1 races be allowed to finish behind the safety car? Could an IndyCar-style red flag rule be brought into effect? This is the yes and no debate, I think, going on amongst fans, amongst a lot of personnel within the paddock. I don't know how much it's worth, but Christian Horner wasn't happy with the way the race finished, even though his driver won, but he wasn't saying that in Abu Dhabi. And I think this is a repercussion of what's happened before in Abu Dhabi. Races finished behind the safety car is not new. The first one was actually in 1999, the Canadian Grand Prix. And we've had a few since then. We actually had a title deciding race finished behind the safety car in 2012. But the one exception to this rule has been Abu Dhabi, where they fudged the rules and they ended up having a final lap shootout because they wanted to finish under green flag conditions. Well, if you want to do that, throw a red flag. Or just accept that a race will just finish behind the safety car. They are your two options. Because we saw in Abu Dhabi that if you try to fast track the rules, then you're going to leave yourself in an awful lot of hot water. And I think the FIA are still nursing the burns from that, and I think they've just been touched upon a little bit here. So there's a few things to consider when you think about the safety car finish and the IndyCar style red flag. So you've got this anticlimactic conclusion which leaves fans potentially shortchanged. They don't quite get their money's worth, and the people paying to watch on TV don't get their, for what it's worth, money's worth as well. We tune into sport to see entertainment, to see high quality racing or play in terms of whatever sport you're watching. And I know, as a football fan, that sometimes you will tune in. I've been in the ground at football matches where it finishes 0-0. And you accept that that's the case. And with motorsport, that can happen, and that's fine. But there is a way to prevent that happening, and that is a red flag rule. But there's a couple of things we have to consider. There's the 2-hour time limit where the race needs to be run, but at the point where the safety car was called in Monza, about an hour and 20 minutes of that 2 hours had gone. Now I think if they'd stopped the race, everyone into the pit lane, cleared Daniel Ricciardo's car with the tractor as they did, it's going to take a few minutes, that's fine. 10-minute warning. Okay, you're looking at 15 minutes, 20 minutes of a stoppage tops. Fine, and then you have a 4-5 lap sprint, because we've seen it before. There is precedent for it. Baku 2021. There's been other occasions where you've had a red flag. However, there is the 75% race distance rule, where if there is a stoppage after 75% of the race distance, a result can be declared. But we've also seen that not enforced before. Monaco 2011, I believe it was. And also Baku 2021. So all of these rules that not having necessarily been followed or enforced at certain points before, it sets a precedent. So you either stick hard and fast to your rules, and you make it any stoppage after 75% is a result. End of. That's it. The race is stopped. The checkered flag is waved. Or you have, you word it differently. It can be declared a result if the race is not able to be resumed within the 2-hour period. The wording of the rules has to be very, very clear. And I think there's an awful lot of these rules are almost not necessarily contradictory, but they're very convoluted and they wind around each other. And it makes it very difficult to actually put a process in place in terms of what you can actually do in a certain situation. Have lessons been learned from Abu Dhabi? That one is up for debate, I think. Because you've got race directors now in Eduardo Freitas and Niels Wittich who are trying to do the right thing, trying to go by the rules, but actually they're still upsetting the fans because the fans want to see racing. That's what we tune in for. Yes, it's a competition, and I think the drivers and the team personnel would appreciate a green flag finish. We all would, as long as it's done correctly. And this, I know we are trampling over old ground now, but this is the problem that Abu Dhabi 21 has created, because you've now got a situation where a race could have been restarted. You could have let only a few lap cars through and had a shootout between the final two, on the final lap or two between the top two drivers in the race, and yet they didn't. So why not have this red flag rule? Teams apparently couldn't agree on it. Don't give them a choice. Just tell them that's what will happen. Because we don't want another Abu Dhabi 2021. We must never see that again. And here was a great opportunity to show how it should be done. So you avoid the anticlimactic finish, you get a green flag finish, and you get the entertainment. You tick every single box that you could possibly want if you're the FIA and Formula One. Let's move on to a slightly more jovial and popular theme from the Italian Grand Prix, and that was Nick DeVries making his Formula One debut for Williams. Not expected, because he did a practice session with Aston Martin on Friday morning. So that's the third different car that he's driven this year. He's driven the Williams at Spain, he drove for Mercedes in France, and he drove for Aston Martin in Italy. And then Alexander Albon came down with appendicitis over Friday night, Saturday morning, and was unable to race. And of course, we've since found out how serious it was. He actually suffered respiratory failure, which that is really concerning. But these are elite athletes, so I would imagine he is able to recover fairly well. Whether we'll see him in Singapore in a few weeks' time or not is debatable. But all the best, Alex Albon. I hope you are feeling better soon. But one man's negative experience was another man's opportunity. And Nick DeVries grabbed that opportunity with both hands. He had a great qualifying session, even though he had a bit of a mishap into the De La Roja chicane on his Q2 lap, but he got into Q2 in the Williams. It was a great performance from him. Ended up starting 8th on the grid because of all the penalties for engines, which is a whole nother thing to talk about. And then he finishes P9. Absolutely incredible. And you've got Latifi, who, for the best will in the world, is trying his best, but he's got limited capability. He can't drag the result out of a car in the same way the very good drivers can. And Nick DeVries is a very good driver, and then you've got the very best, like the Hamiltons, the Verstappens, Schumacher, Alonso, the list goes on, of course, who can drag even more out of a car. But for Nick, it was a great debut. He was solidly running in the midfield. He got himself into a DRS train, and he did the job. He bagged Williams another 2 points. And this is why Williams have to, unfortunately, get rid of Latifi and put a proper driver in there. And I'm not saying, I don't think I'm doing Latifi a disservice there, but I'm talking a driver of serious calibre to go alongside Albon, because DeVries finished 4th in the same GP2 championship, Formula 2 championship. I couldn't remember when it changed. Formula 2 championship as Albon, Norris and George Russell, who all graduated to F1. DeVries went on another season in F2 and became champion the following year. And this performance is incredibly interesting because it shows you what you can achieve if you throw someone in the deep end, whether they sink or swim. Some drivers find it really difficult. We saw Paul Di Resta step into the Williams in 2017, I believe it was, at the Hungaroring for Felipe Massa, and he struggled. He struggled a bit. And that's not knocking Paul Di Resta's talent behind the wheel. I know he's not the most popular person on the TV, but his skills as a racing driver are very, very good. Nick DeVries has shown that he is absolutely capable of a very, very high-level F1 season. Of course, he's got commitments with Maserati in Formula E, but should Williams be able to extricate him from that deal? I think they've got a really good pairing on their hands. And on the occasions where the Williams is competitive, it's scored points this season. So if you have two drivers who are able to score points when the car is competitive, you actually give yourself, surprisingly, a massive opportunity to finish better in the Constructors' Championship. They're staring at another bottom of the table finish. So you could do worse than put Latifi in the car again, but you could do better. And by do better, I mean put Nick DeVries in the car. Williams have got to replace Latifi with DeVries. And I know I said I wanted Logan Sargent in the car, but DeVries has shown with one performance that he's F1 ready. Sargent may or may not be. DeVries is ready. Put him in the car. Alright, so now we're going to rate the drivers, and we'll start, of course, with Max Verstappen, who started from 7th following a grid penalty. He finished first. I'm going to rate him as a 4. I thought he drove well. He moved through the pack. Of course, he's got a car that does that very well. He drove very nicely. Can't give him a 5 because it wasn't a drive that I think where you go, wow. The form he's in, I kind of expected it, to be honest. So a 4 for Max Verstappen. His teammate Sergio Perez came from 13th to 6th. Going to rate him as a 3.5. Again, showed how good a racer he is. He's not just very good on the tyres, Sergio Perez. He is an absolute racer, and some of his overtakes were fantastic. Charles Leclerc with Ferrari started on pole position, finished second. I'm going to rate him as a 3 because I thought, while the strategy wasn't good for him, he played his part in this downfall. And I left this bit out earlier so I could talk about it now. His pace wasn't good enough. He had the car to do it, but his pace just wasn't good enough at certain points of the race. At points it was good enough, but he couldn't sustain it, which was disappointing. So only a 3 for Charles Leclerc. his pole lap was fantastic. Carlos Sainz, he drove beautifully to come from 18th to 4th. I'm going to rate him as a 4 as well. He just was a man possessed in the opening quarter of the race, wasn't he? Just overtaking everything in sight. It was part of the excitement of the race. It was seeing Carlos's run through, but then of course it kind of fizzled out because Ferrari's strategy didn't quite work on the soft tyre. Mercedes and Lewis Hamilton started 19th, finished 5th, a 3.5 for Lewis. Neat and tidy drive. He can still race. He can win from the front. He can do everything. We know that. It was neat and tidy. 5th was where he qualified, I believe, and where he would have finished had he started in his proper position anyway. So, you can say, well, he's achieved what he should have, but he's had to overtake several other cars to do it. George Russell, he started on the front row of the grid, and he actually made a better getaway than Charles Leclerc, but the dragginess of the Mercedes held him back on that run down to the first chicane. He started second, he finished third, 3.5 for George as well, because what he did was manage his own race, and as soon as Ricciardo bottled up everybody else, he made sure he went with those leading pair of Verstappen and Leclerc, and just built himself a buffer so he could come out and have a lovely old time in P3. Lando Norris at McLaren started 3rd, finished 7th. He said there was some mistakes made, but I don't think he'd have really achieved any more than that. He finished best of the rest that wasn't a Red Bull, Mercedes or Ferrari. So you can't say fairer than that from Lando. Rate him as a 3. Daniel Ricciardo, he gets a 3 as well, even though he failed to finish from his 4th position on the grid. He bottled up everyone very, very nicely. It would have been easy to see him overtaken, but he drove very, very neatly and kept them all behind. Disappointing weekend for Alpine, so we'll talk about Ocon and Alonso. Ocon finished 11th, having started 14th. The rate was a 2. He didn't make the progress I'd have expected from him, while Fernando Alonso started 6th, failed to finish. I'm going to rate him as a 2.5 because he was doing a decent job by the point his power unit decided it had enough. Alfa Romeo on home soil finally broke their run of pointless races. Bottas finished 13th, having started 15th, rate him as a 2. Not such a good weekend for Bottas, just a little bit off form at the moment. But Zhou Guanyu started 9th, finished 10th, going to rate him as a 2.5 because he pinched that final point and he was hustling Nick DeVries for that second point as well. So a good job from Zhou. AlphaTauri's Pierre Gasly finished 8th, having started 5th. Rate him as a 2.5 as well. Yuki Tsunoda started last, finished 14th. Rate him as a 2.5 because in a midfield car and you end up at the back with a grid penalty, there's only so much you can do. And I'm not sure Tsunoda's of that sort of calibre like a Gasly where you'd come through and pick up a point from that sort of position. But to finish 14th is probably where he'd have finished anyway. At Haas, it was a pointless weekend for them. Kevin Magnussen started and finished in 16th. He gets a 2. Mick Schumacher provided some very entertaining overtakes from his run to 17th. Mick Schumacher started 17th, finished 12th. He gets a 3. He provided some extremely good action with his overtakes on his way to P12. Aston Martin, they failed to finish with both cars. Both their drivers, Vettel and Stroll, get a 1.5. They were really struggling this weekend. And then we'll round off with Williams, which was DeVries and Latifi. Nick DeVries started 8th, finished 9th, as we've already spoken about. He's the star performer. 5 for Nick DeVries. And Latifi started 10th, finished 15th, rating of a 2. And let's rate the race. A little bit, just a short one here. A potentially brilliant duel was denied us by a combination of the Ferrari strategy and then the race finishing behind the safety car. It was a bit of a damp squib ending, wasn't it? It was thoroughly anticlimactic, unfortunately. So I've got a few other race ratings as well. So to go along with my 6, Louis Edwards and Tom Downey also gave a 6. And Carl King, Sophia Richmond and Phil Matthew gave the race a 5. So that's it for today. The checkered flag is waving on another show. Thank you for joining me. I'll see you when the 5 red lights go out.